And now the floor goes to Raissa Ellis. It's another talk on irony. Raissa, are you with us? Yes, Raissa is here. And Raissa's talk is about direct and broad echo in verbal irony. And there is a question about comprehension that Alisa wants to ask. So can you please share your presentation with us, and the floor is yours.
Good morning or evening. My name is Raissa Ellis and I'm a PhD student at the University of Warsaw. I'm very happy to be included in this conference and hear all the interesting contributions presented today. In my PhD project, I focus on the functions of irony in computer-mediated communication, and I noticed that in CNC, due to the nature of the communicative medium, instances of irony very often feature exact or direct quotation. In CNC, it's just very easy to copy and paste. And on many platforms, a quotation is automatically generated when one responds to earlier messages. And so irony very often takes form of that, of an exact quotation, not a paraphrase, not an allusion, but very often it's just an exact quotation. So as I was searching in the literature for empirical studies, specifically on echo as a direct quotation, I could not find very many clear answers from specifically empirical studies. And that is why I eventually decided to conduct a little study of my own. And this is what I want to talk about today. Before the relevance theoretic account of irony was introduced, the available descriptions of mechanisms involved in the phenomena of verbal irony did not answer the question why speakers would opt to utilize irony. And in classical rhetoric, irony was treated as a trope, where literal meanings of utterances were replaced by figurative counterparts. In the case of irony, the figurative meaning is supposed to be the opposite, contrary or contradictory. For example, the meaning of beautiful weather said ironically during the downpour would be terrible weather. Raissa's theory of implicature explains verbal irony as arising from flouting the maxim of quality, which requires the speaker to say the truth and refrain from making unsupported claims. In the case of ironic statements, this maxim is breached in an obvious way. If both the speaker and the hearer know that the speaker says what the speaker says is a blatant falsehood, then the maxim is exploited to communicate the irony. The challenge that these standard or classical approaches face, aside from failing to address the reason for opting to utilize irony instead of using literal language, was that the approaches proposed that to understand irony, the hearer would first need to process the literal meaning of the utterance, reject it, and only then derive the non-literal meaning, which was challenged, if not disproved, by experimental results and increasingly incompatible with growing insights about human cognition. The relevance theoretic account revolutionized our understanding of this interesting communicative phenomena by providing a cognitively plausible account. They ask you to change the slide. So, according to
sorry, I have changed the slide. Has the slide been changed?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
According to the relevance theoretic account of irony, the underlying mechanism and the point of irony is to express a negative dissociative attitude, which is a higher order thought to an interpretation of another thought mentioned in the ironic remark, which may be attributed to someone else than the speaker at the time of speaking, or a speaker at another time, or another person, a group of people, or even people in general. This uttered interpretation of another thought is the echo. On the one hand, a direct echo constitutes an exact repetition of an exact part of someone else's utterance, or one's own in the past. On the other hand, echo is broadly understood to be an interpretation of a thought held by someone else in the past, whether real or imaginary, accompanied by this propositional attitude of dissociation. And the topic of this study is this spectrum of directness the notion of echo in verbal irony. So the notion of echo has been developed to include a very broad interpretive resemblance of the echoed content, not easily attributable to anyone, and this has caused criticism of the relevant theoretic understanding of irony. The echoed character of examples of irony with the broadly conceived echo has been questioned by a number of scholars. In response to the criticism, Sperber and Wilson explained how the broadly conceived echo occurs in cases with no apparent resemblance. The broadly conceived echo shares an interpretive resemblance, something that Agnieszka already talked about, with the echo's context, and to contrast it with like surface resemblance, this direct quotation. In her 2016 book, Piskorska offers the following examples of ironic comments, all of which echo the same expectation of a beautiful weather towards which the ironist expresses a dissociative attitude during their example. What a beautiful day. I love it when it's sunny. Shall we sit in the garden? The speaker of, for example, the third example, does not want to convey the opposite, that she loves it when it is rainy or that she hates it when it is sunny. But rather, the interpretive resemblance is shared with the same as in the example, the first example that shows a direct repetition, a quotation. So the difference in the surface resemblance of the source of echo does not impede irony comprehension in any way. The source of echo being the expectation of a beautiful weather, the very phrase beautiful. Even though the first example that I mentioned in this talk is the direct repetition of the phrase beautiful weather, and example 3 differs greatly in its form, the mechanism involved is exactly the same, and the comprehension of irony should not be impeded if all other factors remain unchanged. And so when looking for empirical studies to support the claim that broadly echoic ironies are comprehended as well as those with direct repetition of the echoed content, I did not find clear answers. There is a 1999 experimental study done by Keenan and Quigley in which a relevant theoretic perspective was adopted. They compared the impact of the type of echo on children's comprehension of irony. 6 to 10-year-old children were given stories containing either a sarcastic comment that explicitly echoed an earlier remark, a sarcastic comment that only implicitly alluded to an earlier remark, or a literal comment from the speaker. The stories were presented as audio recordings because the children's ability to read was a factor, and so the researchers also tested the impact of intonation. The results showed that when vocal intonation was absent, children comprehend explicit stories much better than implicit stories. The children found it easier to understand the speaker's intended meaning when the ironic remark was an explicit echo of the previous utterance, and this difference in successful comprehension between stories with broadly conceived echo and direct repetition was statistically significant. The authors pointed out that the children relied on directly echoed information in their comprehension of irony, and the indirectly echoed information was not relied on to the same extent. The children's understanding of the concepts of mind, beliefs, desires, intentions is just developing, and so conclusions from this study may not be extended to apply to adult language users. To the best of my knowledge, there were no such studies of similar nature conducted with adult participants. There were some older studies that addressed this topic, but they did not answer the question I posed, and the research was not conducted from a relevant theoretic perspective. For instance, in Gibbs's 1986 series of experiments with adult participants, in one of the experiments, Gibbs compared ironies containing explicit echoes with ironies with implicit allusions to social norms, and he actually labeled those as non-echoic, which stands in contradiction to their key account. And in the experimental materials, the explicit echoes were also not direct repetitions, but rather paraphrases. And so I'm not going to rely on that study, even though it addressed that topic. And since I was left without an answer from the empirical literature, I conducted a study aiming to discover if the form of the echoed content, whether the echo is direct or broadly conceived, could have a significant impact, a significant effect on irony comprehension in adults. So the hypothesis in this study is as follows. In adult language users, the form of resemblance of the echoed content does not influence irony comprehension. And so I'd like to hypothesize that more specifically, rates of successful comprehension of irony would be equivalent in both direct and broad echo conditions if one were to have those two juxtaposed. And more specifically, the participants in both conditions would have similar success rates at answering a truth value judgment question regarding a statement ascribing relevant or irrelevant beliefs to the irony. The questions posed to participants are intended to allow for indirect elicitation of irony comprehension by exploiting the participants' meta-representational ability, which, according to Wilson, plays a crucial role in irony processing. If the hypothesis is confirmed, the result would support the relevance theoretic claim that it is the interpretive resemblance that constitutes echo in verbal irony, and that adult language users do not rely on direct echo in the same way as children. They don't depend on it. And to further justify the hypothesis, I'd like to point out that according to the irony requires a second-order theory of mind abilities, and that the listener needs to understand that the speaker is distancing herself from the literal content. Children, even at 11 years of age, are not able to master irony as well as adults, and irony production only extends in the developmental period of adolescence. So this previous study cannot be relied on, and there is a need for further investigation. The participants in the study were recruited through the crowdsourcing platform, Amazon Mechanical Turk. And since the language of the experimental materials was English, the participants were recruited from the UK and the USA. High competence based on their previous performance and surveys so far was required, and only respondents with a 95 approval rate were chosen for this test. A total of 60 participants took part. 34 participants identified as females, and all participants were adults ages 18 to 49. They were also paid a small fee to take part in this. And now about the method. The study adopted a between subject design with 60 participants total, with two conditions, broad and direct echo, with 30 participants in each condition. Each participant responded to 5 out of 30 randomly selected structurally matching vignettes. Each vignette had the same structure and consisted of an introduction of the context, including a sentence later echoed by an irony, and the ironic remark, which in the directly echoed condition consisted of an exact repetition of phrases from the introduction, and in the broadly echoed condition shared solely an interpretive resemblance with the echoed context. The study opted for indirect installation of irony. The questions exploited the participants' misrepresentational ability. So after each vignette, the participants answered a truth value judgment question regarding a statement ascribing relevant or irrelevant beliefs to the irony. In order to obtain a counterbalance design, 15 items. In 15 items, a correct answer was true, and in the other 15 items, the correct answer was false. And now about the procedure. I utilized the Qualtrics survey software. Two separate Qualtrics surveys were developed for each condition to distribute the materials to the participants. The online format enabled access to unique population of participants that I would otherwise not be able to contact and test, as well as access to features required by experimental design, such as random presentation of a smaller number of experimental items from a larger pool. There was a sort of a trick question at the beginning of the survey, an attention check adopted from experimental studies by David and Thoreau was copied. I thought it was a great idea to ensure that the participants read the vignettes before answering. Next, each participant saw saw there's 5 experimental items randomly selected from the pool of 30, one at a time, each followed by a response with 2 options to choose from, true or false, and finally some demographic section. And the results, so the attention check, right? I wanted to show you this attention check question. I think it's quite interesting. It appeared at the beginning, and it basically it was this lengthy description, and it ended with a "Have you attended university?" question. And if the participants were to answer, if they attended university, they would have failed this attention check. However, all of them passed it. They were basically supposed to read the whole description and answer it, so I did not have to exclude anyone from the study. I wanted to share an example of a vignette. This is an example used in the study. All 30 vignettes used shared a structural similarity to this one. So it starts with an introduction of the context of the ironic utterance. This introduction includes the source of the echo. Participants assigned to the direct echo condition were presented a different ironic utterance than participants assigned to the broad echo condition. However, it was ensured that both of these utterances shared interpretive resemblance, that it was comparable. Participants of both conditions responded to the same truth value judgment question, asking them to decide whether a statement about the state of the speaker at the time of speaking was true or false. And so the example reads, Lisa and John visited Rome. They were sightseeing all day. In the evening, they were deciding between going to a popular restaurant that gets quite busy and crowded, or a little quiet cafe for dinner. Lisa wanted to go to the cafe. Lisa said, "A quiet place is better after such a busy day." The cafe wasn't crowded, but a beginner trumpeter was practicing scales nearby, which was audible at the cafe. In the direct echo condition, John said, "I'm glad we went with a quiet place after such a busy day," in which he repeats a fragment of the earlier utterance. In the broad echo condition, he says something else, but that sentence shares an interpretive resemblance. "What a lovely restful cafe to culminate today's event." And then the participants had to answer to respond to this vignette. They were presented with the following instructions. Based on John's comment, please indicate below whether you think the following statement is true or false. John was unhappy with the choice of the location. And another example is the vignette with the correct answer being false. And this was adopted to achieve a counterbalanced design, where half of the vignettes were constructed with the correct answer being false. Sydney and Lynn, who wanted to serve their sister's favorite dish, chili crab, for her graduation dinner. They traveled for an hour to a market known for having the best selection of fresh seafood in town, according to Linda. They found many empty stalls and a pitiful choice of fish, commonly available in lots of stores. In direct echo condition, Sydney says, "I'm glad we came to the market with the best selection of fresh seafood in town." And in the broad echo condition, she uttered, "Wow, I'm a bit overwhelmed with all the choices." So the participants are again instructed in the same manner to consider Sydney's comment, and based on that comment to indicate whether they think the statement is true or false. And the statement was, according to Sydney, the market has a good selection of goods. So the statement towards which the participants need to provide their judgment ascribes a false belief to the speaker. By selecting false, the participants demonstrate their recognition of speaker's intention. And participants would opt for literal interpretation of the speaker's utterance would select true and thus fail to reject the false belief ascribed to the speaker. The results were calculated as is usual practice to facilitate statistical data analysis in such studies by being coded as numbers, incorrect as zeros, incorrect as ones, and a comparison of means was performed. The results of the independent t-test indicated that there was no significant effect for the type of echo. And now I could discuss the results. So they indicate that adults do not depend on directness of echo in irony comprehension in the same way as children. The results appear to confirm that Relevance theoretic claim that echo and verbal irony is achieved through interpretive resemblance. And although echo may involve an exact repetition of an earlier utterance, phrase, or statement candidly expressing some commonly shared norm, it does not have to. Echo may also involve no repetition. It may constitute a very broadly construed paraphrase, yet still, at the same time, rather closely interpretively resemble the source proposition. So as long as the level of interpretive resemblance is equivalent, in adults, a direct repetition does not appear to have any impact on irony comprehension. In conclusion, I have to say that the echoic account of irony provides a cognitively plausible explanation of the mechanism involved in communication of verbal irony, and it follows from the RT account that the notion of echo is crucial to irony, as every ironic remark necessarily involves echoic use. And there is an interpretive resemblance between the echoed content and its source. It may involve a repetition that is direct or not, and in adult language users, the form of the resemblance does not affect irony comprehension. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raissa, for this very interesting presentation. We've got basically 6 minutes for questions now. Yes. The floor is open to discussion. Go ahead, Deirdre.
Thank you. Thank you, Raissa. I thought it was a very nice presentation and a very nice demonstration of the ability of adults to spot, even fairly distant echoes. I have to say that that there are some cases of irony that Dan uses, which are very, very distant. And I think there's one in a paper we wrote on Alice in Wonderland. I can't remember what it was. And the question is, I wonder how far you can push people. There may be a point where it just is too distant, and I don't know how one would establish that. But actually, the example Agnieszka. That you gave from Agnieszka was, shall we sit in the garden on a rainy day? For me, I think that's a wonderful example, but it's just absolutely the limits of what I could take, I think. And I suppose it sort of moves over into joke rather than irony. And that borderline, I think, is really, really interesting. I don't know how one could experiment on that, but Raissa, I thought your experiment was really, really nice, and it pushes us to keep on asking questions in that direction.
Thank you very much.
Further questions and comments, please. We've got enough time for at least one question or a comment. Go ahead, Agnieszka.
Sorry, thank you so much. I'm thinking, and that I think that it is there has to be a certain balance between the recognizability of echo and ludicrousness, because sometimes when the echo is sort of weaker or like marginally perceivable, maybe you can make up by making it more ludicrous, right? I'm thinking about this example of yours, like with this, I'm overwhelmed, the fish market thing. Yes, I'm overwhelmed by this, by the choices or something, right? So this is how I see it. So maybe this the ludicrousness sort of saves, that makes irony more communicable in such cases. It's just a tiny remark. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Just as a follow-up to what Agnieszka just said, there's the paper by Kreutz and talking about hyperbole as a cue to irony, and I mean I find that very convincing, that sort of exaggerating makes it sort of clear at least you're not being literal. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Raissa, for your interesting talk, and good luck with your further research. And